Good morning. At this time of the year, the board considers those issues that are related to boundary changes and the capital improvements program. Prior to this morning, the superintendent provided to the board her recommendation for the relocation of Burtonsville Elementary School and for the boundary study scope for the reopening of Charles W. Woodward High School. Today, the board will hold its work session regarding these recommendations. If alternatives are offered today, the board will hold a hearing on March 20th. If no alternatives are offered, there will be no hearing held on March 20th. As noted during our work session on February 23, 2023, if board members wish to identify any alternatives today, they should do so through a motion. If there is a second, a vote will be taken after a brief discussion of the alternative. A majority of board member votes is required in order to place the alternative before the public for comment, along with the superintendent's recommendation. If the alternative is adopted today by the board, staff will notify the affected community so they may testify to the superintendent's recommendation and the alternative. Please keep in mind that a vote to place an alternative before the board does not commit board members to support the alternative when final action is taken, nor does it preclude the board from making any changes to the CIP when it takes final action. The board is scheduled to take final action on these matters on Tuesday, March 28, 2023 at 3:30 p.m. I'm going to just have our board members introduce themselves to ensure we have a quorum. Ms. Harris?
Good morning, everyone. Lynn Harris at large.
Spondrowski?
Good morning, Rebecca Spondrowski, District 2.
Good morning, Shebra Evans, District 4.
Good morning, Brenda Wolf, District 5.
Good morning, Buenos Dias, Grace Rivera Owen, District 1.
Good morning, Julie Yang, District 3.
Okay, Dr. McKnight, do you have any comments?
Yes, good morning, board members. I look forward to our discussion today. Today we're going to be giving information about the capital budget and amendments to it, along with the capital improvements program. Today's presentation actually is one that's pretty timely. Just last week, we heard from our public and during our hearings, and we got a lot of feedback regarding things that were important to our community members. They talked about whatever the scope being, communicating that early. I actually feel that we've already started that process. That was one of the reasons we decided to be able to bring forward what the scope would be, although the specifics of planning around that will not happen until the fall. So that was one way that I will say I was encouraged that we were starting the process so that we could engage community members early in the process. As we discuss the topics today, I do want to remind us we went to our county council on January 23rd for our first Education and Culture Committee meeting where we gave a CIP presentation there as well. Well, gave a presentation on our capital budget and how we were looking to utilize that. Since then, we did have to send over non-recommended recommendations. There are a number of things that we have put in place. The other night, we heard a lot about Burtonsville from that community. We agreed that that was going to be a priority moving forward in terms of how we plan for the funding that we have for the projects that would need to move forward. So I just want to thank you for all of the considerations given to taking the voices of our community around, things that they have found to be important with history with the system and bringing it current to our priorities and what's important to them, and us just essentially sharing what we are going to do with our CIP budget, giving the amendments that we've had to make, but making sure we keep our priorities in place. So with that, I look forward to our discussion today, which will be a brief one, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Adams.
Thank you, Dr. McKnight and President Silvestri and members of the board. If we could pull up the slides, we'll go through this rather quickly. So the next slide, we'll just, again, to reiterate Dr. McKnight, we'll just revisit the recommendation of the superintendent for Burtonsville, revisit the recommendation for the boundary studies scope to reopen Charles Woodward High School, and then also just talk about, just some of the next steps in terms of what we heard from the public comments. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, the superintendent's recommendation after reviewing the possible sites that were in the existing service area of Burtonsville Elementary was to focus on the existing site that we do own, the property that was transferred to MCPS, the Board of Education in 2019. As we talked about, this site is approximately 2 miles away from the existing elementary school. It's within the service area. It does allow for a greater opportunity for students to walk. As next steps, assuming we make it to a point where the board approves this site, we would obviously go through a variety of steps: transportation analysis, obviously architecture selection, where community would be involved in the building. And I think also what's really important here is diving into the existing building and what we would ultimately use that for, and the opportunities that we have for that building to serve our needs as a public district here. The thing is, I would say, is that there are very few sites and school buildings that are publicly owned in this area, so this is going to be a critical building for us for the future and serving everything from our blueprint needs to other academic needs. So all that will ultimately happen from an engagement perspective should the board approve this site as the location for the new Burtonsville Elementary School. Next slide. Again, just to reorient from with that maps, the existing Burtonsville is the blue diamond. I know it's a little hard to see from these maps, and the new location that's been recommended is the one that's the plan right, sort of center of the map here on the right. And you can see it is in the existing Burtonsville service area. Again, that's really important. It's not just in the Northeast Consortium, it's in the service area of Burtonsville Elementary as it stands today. Next slide. And then just geographically, it's a 10-acre site, so it does offer a lot of opportunities for us to, build an elementary school that has, great outdoor amenities, access for buses, walkers, drop-off loops. So we're excited about a site like this that has frontages on two sides of a possible school build. So, but we would ultimately walk through that with the community on the best possible design and siting through that process. If we go to the next slide, I think that's about it for this. From the work session, I don't think we necessarily heard anything negative about the site, really just prioritizing Burtonsville as a school from a funding perspective. But open it up for any questions.
If you have any questions or comments, please turn your light on. Let's start with Mrs. Madrowski.
Just one quick question. When you mentioned the transportation analysis and things like that, I was going to ask essentially why we do all of that after approval as opposed to before, but then I started thinking about it. And can you just clarify, are you talking more about like the actual bus runs and things like that? We've done transportation, enough of a transportation analysis and other type of surveys that we know it can work if it's approved, right?
No, that's a good question. One of the things that ultimately you look at from a detailed traffic and transportation is not only bus stops, what are the impacts to those that are either bus riders that could become walkers? Since we don't have walkers now, you don't have that sort of change from walker to bus rider. So I think there's a positive here where we would just be going more in the walking route. The other part of the analysis is also just looking at it from traffic transportation. The traffic piece does usually come a little bit later in the process. That is a very formal process that goes through, Park and Planning Commission, through the MCDOT. It's a little bit more of a lengthy process, but that process ultimately just makes recommendations on us in terms of routing, directions of flow, those sorts of things. But we don't usually do that on the front end because, every one of our sites is accessible by bus, is accessible by car. It's really just having an opportunity to walk through it with families that are not accustomed to either being bus rider or walkers, and then also just looking at it from a traffic flow and making improvements where necessary from it.
Okay, I appreciate that. I was just concerned that if we pick, I don't want any delays or anything that we do to delay it. So I would just want to make sure that it's fine that it's going to work out transportation flow-wise and all of that. So thanks.
And I would just add, though, too, one of the things, part of traffic, when you think about transportation, you don't necessarily think about walkers. We'll obviously look at it from a sidewalk, from an infrastructure, Vision Zero perspective, work with the county on any recommendations that would be needed to improve the pedestrian flow as well. So.
Ms. Wolf?
Well, I just want to thank you. I know that we have challenges all over the county in terms of buildings, but as you know, I've always believed that East County, the investment in that part of the county has been lacking. So I'm very pleased by this, and I just want to be sure that we keep this on track. Thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate something that you just said, Mr. Adams, which is currently in the current location, regardless of where a student lives, there is no safe way to walk to that school. And, as we look to, we have so many priorities, and, sustainability and reducing our carbon footprint is one. And, getting, driving fewer miles is really key to that. And then it's a huge priority for the school system, for, our state delegation, county planning, to make it possible for people to safely walk and navigate the county, not in a vehicle. So I so appreciate the fact that this location of the school will truly make it, you could see on the map, easy for a huge community of people to walk to that facility. And then I think we are on track to have, well in advance of the transportation work that Ms. Mondrowski was talking about, we'll have the new bus tracking, planning, routing software in place that will actually help us to do that work in a way that really maximizes the efficiency of any transportation that we do need. So really appreciate the way that we are looking at this from so many different perspectives when we're looking at design and location and transportation.
I'm looking at your next steps and timeline. I see you architect selection process this spring and summer, community engagement meetings next school year. I always like to have it in the back of my mind, when is construction going to start and when the school will be open. Any estimates, your best estimate so far?
Well, so as we talked about in the first one, we kept the completion date as 2027. And that was from the 2-year delay at the last CIP. One of the opportunities, and again, I think we talked about this, no making, empty promises here, but one of the aspects of design for a new school is typically an 18-month design and 18-month build. So certainly if we come up with a solution, utility work is straightforward, there's the opportunity to even accelerate, but that's something that we'll work with the community as we go through the design process and identify any challenges that may prevent that. But right now it is 2027, and theoretically the design would start as soon as that architect is selected and start with the engagement part.
Thank you, that's helpful. Right, if there's no other comments, then we can move to the next presentation.
All right, so if we could pull the slides back up, we'll just dive right into the scope of work for the Charles Woodward High School. Again, just framing this in terms of the starting point, which was capacity. Certainly the recommendation to reopen Charles Woodward was based on the overutilization within the Downtown County Consortium as well as the WJ Walter Johnson cluster. And also the Northwood expansion is part of this process. So just to reiterate, right now as it stands as part of the CIP, which is an approved, and it's also it's not being considered as part of non-recommended. So right now 2026 is the timeline for both Woodward to open as well as Northwood, the larger Northwood to open. So 2026 is the year in which we would transition into the requirement for a boundary study. So as you can see in Dr. McKnight's recommendation, it is to include all schools within the Downtown County Consortium, as well as Walter Johnson, as well as BCC and Walt Whitman. We did hear from many during the testimony to make sure that individual schools of the Downtown County Consortium were included, and that is correct, right? Every school, Blair, Einstein, Kennedy, Northwood, and Wheaton are all included in this recommendation. Also going down to the middle school level, all schools within those high school clusters, as well as the Downtown County Consortium, are included, which is the 14, which is you have the 2 from the BCC, Silver Creek, Westland. In the DCC, you have Argyle, Eastern, Loiterman, Newport Mill, Parkland, Odessa Shannon, Silver Spring International, Sligo, Tacoma Park. And then you have the two from the WJ, which are North Bethesda and Tilden, and the one in Whitman, Thomas Pyle. So that is the scope of the boundary, which, again, just to clarify, the scope means which schools are part of the process that will be evaluated. And also just to clarify from the recommendation, it does not include elementary schools. This boundary would utilize existing elementary school service areas as the zones to really start to think about what are the changes and transitions that would occur at the middle school and high school level. We did talk about that at the first work session. I think we heard a little bit about it from some of the advocates about possibly including elementary schools. I would just say the change from the elementary school to what the current recommendation is when you start to look at individual elementary schools, that's where you dive into individual communities, meaning you start looking at it from a street, from a neighborhood perspective, really doing a much deeper dive into specific communities. This, obviously, you are looking at communities, but it's from an established elementary school service area perspective and moving forward from that. So just wanted to clarify, from what the differences are. If we can go to the next slide, this is really just the map. We think this is an important map because it does show the geography of what we're talking about here. It's also important to understand, as we talked about before, as we think about Crown High School as that opens, that entire left side of this map of the county, will most likely be impacted and included as part of that scope. And as you think about Damascus expansion, really rounding out the top half of the county. And then certainly, at some point, really, the portions that are not included in those three projects that we're talking about are the Northeast Consortium and currently Magruder and Rockville and Sherwood. So there's opportunities, obviously, to really think about it from a full county perspective at some point, but as it stands right now, there are three projects that would include majority of all high schools as we move forward. Next slide. Again, this is just to reiterate the anticipated timeline for the boundary study. The reason we are starting now is it is a 2-year. I mean, we talk about it from 2026, but that will be here before we know it. And this engagement that is so critical is going to take time. So obviously, starting as soon as possible is important. But really starting this spring through a request for proposal for a firm to be able to help through our engagement process. To help through, navigating this with our communities. We'd like to have them online for, this summer, fall, to really then begin that deep engagement process, start to develop, a variety of options, which again, I think when you think about the scale, there's going to be lots and lots of different options to think about and to consider. The one thing that we did hear in the testimony was really, as early as possible to release the boundary report, which I think is important, but also I think it's important to reiterate that as options are coming online, as we're introducing options and developing feedback, all of that ultimately is the report, right? It's not a big reveal at the end. You're developing options that ultimately, builds out what the report will be. So I just wanted to clarify that there's not this big surprise around the boundary report itself. So as the engagement continues, everyone will know and be a part of that process. The element that is a little different is the superintendent's recommendation. The superintendent obviously will evaluate that report, evaluate all the options, and make a recommendation that is in the best interest of the school district. I would just say that is the very difficult part of this, right? There's many factors that are included as per policy as part of the boundary study process, but ultimately it comes down to making a recommendation of one direction. And certainly that direction takes into consideration all the factors and all the feedback along the way. So we're expecting that to be released as part of basically a spring amendment, similar to what we're doing here today in the winter of 2025, going through that process of work session, public hearings, then ultimately a decision in that same winter of 2025. So it's just giving you a little bit of the timeline, the background of what is going to happen next. All right, next slide. And that concludes that portion, and open it up for any discussion.
Please turn your light on if you have any questions, Mrs. Modrowski.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just also wanted to say quickly, because I was not there, but I was listening in on the testimony, so I wanted to publicly thank everybody for their testimony. I don't really have a question, I just more of a reiteration. We did hear multiple people talk about the split articulation. That's something that's always concerned me as well. So just putting it out there that, I hope we can try and look at ways of keeping that as much to a minimum as possible. Is really important. And again, I just wanted to thank everybody for their testimony. It was very on point. So thank you.
Ms. Yang?
Yes, so thank you for the presentation. This is going to be exciting to relieve some of the overcrowded situations in many of our schools, and it's an exciting opportunity to look at programming for our system. Now, during the public hearing, we did hear comments about allowing public more time, especially after the superintendent's recommendation, and have a little bit more time for the work session and public hearing after that before we have the final vote. So typically in the past, according to testimony, it's about a 2 or 3 week window. Are we looking at, and I think it is important, these are volunteers that have full-time job and families. Are we looking at potentially making that a little bit more time for the public to be engaged?
And that's something we will obviously look at and consider. I would just say our previous boundary studies, even thinking about if they come out in the fall or the winter, there's typically about a month of when the superintendent's recommendation is released to when we have our first work session. And then there's usually about a month's time between that first work session and then ultimately a board vote. So, we'll certainly look at it, but it is about a 2-month process.
Okay.
We can certainly see if there's opportunities to extend that, but ultimately 2 months is a pretty large amount of time to be able to work through some nuances. But we're hopeful that we can obviously navigate any challenges or concerns during the study process itself, navigating through a variety of different options leading to a report. So I think that's one of the things that we will obviously strive to do, is to make sure that report is more of an interactive type of process versus, this sort of one touch point, move on, and then wait for a document to come out. So that's going to be a little bit of our public hearing follow-up around what do we do and how do we think about the engagement process and partnering with a firm to help navigate that.
So just to clarify, so after the superintendent's recommendation is released, between the work session, public hearing, and the board's final vote, there's about a 2-month engagement period.
About a 2-month.
Thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate the transparency and the whole strategy that we're using to truly engage all the different communities in the conversation here. And I also appreciate the breadth of this scope. And I also appreciated that at the hearing, we heard support. I don't think we heard anybody criticize a larger scope of analysis in looking at how we assign students to schools when we bring this new opportunity online. And I had the real treat yesterday, unexpectedly, to run into Ananya Tatakonda, who was our 2018-19 student member of the board. And she and I were talking about a bunch of things, and she was just courageously transformative in how the board looks at issues of true diversity and equity in the system, including through how we establish boundaries and populations for schools. And she took a hit for that from certain segments of our adult population. The students were wholesale behind her, but not all the adults in this county. And, we were talking a little bit about that. And I really do think that we're moving forward a bit. And to me, the hearing last week was testament to her work, because we did hear just support. We didn't hear people coming out. And I mean, she's going to graduate with high honors from the University of North Carolina in a month or two, and then is off to medical school in the fall. But yeah, so I just wanted to give her a little shout out because I think where we are now is a product of the work she started.
Ms. Rivera-Oven?
Thank you. So the consultant that you're hiring to start the engagement process with the community, that's going to happen soon. So that's going to be starting this fall, correct?
Yes, we would like to go through the procurement process this spring, summer for a fall start to the engagement.
So again, from the testimony that we heard, I want to reiterate how important it is, whoever these consultants are, that they have the capability to engage the whole community. And we had this conversation, but I want to make sure the public knows that this conversation has happened, because sometimes there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes that folks don't get to hear, but that it has to be deliberate, that we do an RFP that it accommodates the diversity that we have with the different languages, the top 4 languages that we have in our county, because this process is a big undertaking, and we need to make sure that we have room at the table for all voices to participate. And I'd like to reiterate what my colleague, Ms. Yang, said about that process after the superintendent makes that recommendation, that we give these communities enough time to give us feedback and engagement. So whoever these folks are with the RFP, I think they also, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that the superintendent said, we should make sure that the capabilities and some of the reports that they give us are also in different languages so that we can share that with the community at large, so our staff doesn't have to do that. And I think the more we start doing that, the better engagement and communication we're going to have with our diverse population. So just want to reiterate that. Thank you.
And just to reiterate, add on to what Ms. Rivera-Oven has said, I've sat here for 5 years, and consultant after consultant has come and said, we tried, but we could not reach the community. And so we're in a new day, new era. We don't want to hear that again. Not check the box, translation, interpretation, engagement, but true meaningful engagement. Not presentations that are translated, interpreted, no. Presentations that are designed with that community in mind from the start. Our folks in the equity office know how to do this well. Our Everett Davis and his shop know how to do this well. So let's involve them in the RFP so that we are asking the right questions so that we get the consultants that we need to do this work. If there are no other questions, then that concludes this part of the presentation. I just do want to double check with our first presentation. There were no alternatives put forth to the superintendent's recommendation. Therefore, no vote is needed at this time. And I have something to read here. This concludes our spring facilities and boundaries work session. Thank you, board members, for your comments and questions. And thank you to the staff for the presentation.